Hey everyone, good morning. Welcome to the Stash Bandit studio. It may not be morning where you are. I'm starting just a minute and a half early because good morning, so nice to see you here. I'm starting just about a minute early so that my coworkers can share this Facebook Live to some of our other channels. Quilter's World, Annie's. So wherever you're joining me from, welcome. I'm so glad to have you here. Um, I'd like to know what you're working on. So if you have a chance, say hey in the comments and tell us what you're working on. If you're doing some sewing. I've had holiday sewing on my mind because I've been giving my Jingle Bells Trunk Show to quilt guilds around the country via Zoom, which is actually great fun. It's turned out to be kind of the silver lining of this odd time that we're living in. Um, so today we are going to be talking about a couple of really useful ideas for quilting your borders, and I'm going to be sharing about that. So we're going to just give it another minute or so. Tell us where you're from in the comments. Would love to hear where you're joining from. We usually have people from all over the US, and then we usually have 3 or 4 foreign countries joining us. So that's always fun to see also. I have a daughter, and she has all of my grandchildren, and they live in Hong Kong, which is literally the other side of the planet from me. So I always love hearing where people are. So we're right at about 11 now, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Stash Bandit studio. I'm Diane Harris, and I'm here today for Quilter's World and Annie's, and I'm so glad that you've joined us from wherever you are, and I hope your day is off to a great start. And what we're going to be talking about today are a couple of tricks that I think you'll find useful for quilting the borders on your projects. But what's really great is that if you like this, you can adapt it to quilt over the entire surface of your quilt with your walking foot. What's not to love about that? So let me first show you a few things that I stitched out. So just let me get my camera close enough here. So I stitched out this little sample. So what I'm going to show you for the borders can be used with a variety of stitches. So down the center here, you'll see just a straight stitch. One of my favorite stitches on the machine with a walking foot is a serpentine stitch. And a serpentine stitch is found on many computerized sewing machines, and it makes this wave back and forth while you sew straight. So you're not doing any of the work here. The machine is doing all of that work. You can adjust the serpentine so that the heels are further apart or closer together the way you see them here. Another favorite thing that I love to do in the borders is to combine a straight stitch with a zigzag stitch. So you just quilt along straight for a while, and then you stop, switch to zigzag, and you put in an inch or so of zigzag. And when you put those lines next to each other and the zigzags fall in different places, it looks really wonderful. I have a quilt I'll show you that on in just a few minutes. You can actually use decorative stitches on your sewing machine to quilt as well. You know, we all have these machines that have 387 decorative stitches, but I find it a challenge to know where to use them. So this is a great place to take advantage of all those stitches that are on your machine. So what I want to show you is the route by which you can easily quilt your borders, and you don't have to break the thread. You don't have to stop quilting, and it's really a useful thing to know. Hang on one second. I had one little technical glitch. There we go. What you want to do, this is meant to simulate a quilt. So pretend that this is the quilt center and it's all quilted real nicely. And you can see I put a little line of quilting there to kind of indicate that. So what you want to do is, it's really helpful if you can start in a seam line, like right here where the top border is attached to the side border. So I start right there, and I will have decided ahead of time if I want to come out maybe a half an inch or an inch or whatever. So I will know, and then I'll have decided ahead of time how far apart I want my lines of quilting. So for today, we'll maybe say half an inch. So I start here and I secure my thread. Now don't panic. I'm going to mark on this little quilt because this is what it was made for. So I start here and I secure my thread right in that seam line, which just makes it a little less noticeable. And then I normally use the edge of my walking foot to keep this line of stitching straight. If you prefer, you could mark with a chalk marker or a disappearing pin or whatever, but I don't usually mark because I like to just use the edge of my walking foot. So I bury my threads here, or do a tiny few stitches in place, and then I'm going to go around the quilt like so. So there are two different routes that I'm going to show you. So this is the route where you quilt separate lines of stitching. So this first line of stitching, you're going to start here and you're going to quilt down here. And of course my drawing may not be the best today, but you'll still get the idea. So when you go a half an inch past, you pivot with your needle down and continue along this way. So if your machine has a needle down feature, you would want to engage that. When you come to this corner, you go a half an inch past, pivot with your needle down and come on up here. Half an inch past, quilt right here. And then you're just going to quilt right off the edge of the quilt, just like that. So that's your first line of stitching. The second line of stitching, I would come out half an inch, let's say, and I would repeat the same process. Go half an inch past that first line, all along here, half an inch past, come up here, half an inch past, and quilt right off the quilt. And for this one, I'd probably do 3 lines, so same exact thing. Come out a half an inch, da-da-da-da. By now you understand what we're doing. There you go. So you've only had to start and stop right here in this little seam, and it looks beautiful. It just is a great trick. So there is one other route that I also really like, so let me show you that one. I'll put my next little quilt sample up here. Throw in a pin so it stays there. And let me explain why I start up here in the top right-hand corner of the quilt. I want the bulk of the quilt to be over here by my left arm. If this was a large quilt, there'd be a bunch of bulk over here. Well, you don't want that bulk over here by your right hand, which would be under the arm of the machine. You want that bulk all over here. So this, starting in this corner, accomplishes that. So again, I would start in this seam line. I would anchor those stitches. This route is just slightly different. So I would come down here, go a half an inch past, quilt along here, half an inch past, come here. Now here's where it gets to be a little different. I go a half an inch past my first line of stitching, and then with the needle down, I raise the presser foot and pivot, and I go around again. Half an inch past, da-da-da, half an inch past, da-da-da-da-da. Coming around for my final one, I go half an inch past, needle down, presser foot up, dun-da-dun-da-dun. Same thing. And this would be my final line of stitching. And I go half an inch past, and I come here, and I just quilt right off the edge of the quilt. So I have not had to start or stop my stitching anywhere except for right here at the very beginning. And I've hidden that one in that little seam. So this is just a really great trick to use. And for those of you who might have stopped by late, let me just show you again some of the stitches that I use for this. I love straight stitch. Sometimes a quilt just calls for straight stitch. I love the serpentine stitch, and you can adjust the heels to be a little tighter or a little looser. I love to combine straight with zigzag. That's a great look that I'll show you on a quilt in just a second. And you can use decorative stitches. This little snowflake here, I once put that in a little 1/2 inch border on a Christmassy quilt, and I used sparkly white thread, and it was just beautiful. So those are a few of the stitches that you can use. Now, let me show you a couple of quilts that I have this on. This is a little quilt called Asterisk, and I want to show you this corner of the quilt. Asterisk was designed by Karen Griska, and she has an Etsy shop called Karen Griska Quilts, and it's a great little design. But you can see here where I've used that serpentine stitch with matching thread to quilt those borders. And in this quilt, I actually quilted the entire quilt with serpentine. You can see here in the asterisk block that I just quilted that serpentine stitch over the whole surface of the quilt. And I went from one block to the next without stopping, and I did all the diagonals in the same way. And it just looks terrific on the quilt. The whole thing is done with that serpentine stitch. So that is Karen Griska's Asterisk quilt. I love sharing this quilt when I do programs in person because people really enjoy seeing this stitch. So this is a scrap quilt with a black and white border. And what you see here in the border, that is a contrasting variegated thread that I quilted where I shared that idea earlier of you do straight stitch and then you switch to zigzag and you go back to straight stitch. And then you might switch to zigzag, and you just do it randomly. I'm going to bring it in just a little bit closer so that you can see it. It's just great fun. It looks really nice on the quilt. You can listen to music or a podcast while you're doing it because you don't really have to think too hard. And it looks great. You can do a contrasting thread or a sparkly thread. That is a really fun thing to do. You can see here on the corner where as I got to that miter, that's where I stopped with my needle down and lifted my presser foot and went around that corner. So that's my little scrap quilt. The next quilt is an autumn piece that I did, I think it was just last year. And I did a lot of serpentine on the surface of this quilt. You can see it pretty clearly in the peach colored border, and I guess you can also see it in the dark gray charcoal. But I also used it in the quilt center. Can't see that quite as well, but that is actually serpentine also. And then here in, let's see if I can, this is a little bit awkward, but let's see if I can show you. There we go. This is the part I want you to see here. In the center of the quilt, I did straight lines with straight stitch, but then at a certain point I switched to serpentine to add interest. So I thought those straight lines were fine. It's a sort of an austere quilt, a sort of a sparse, spare look. So those straight lines were fine for a while, but then I felt like it needed a little more interest, so I switched to serpentine. I wish I could think of the name of this quilt and you could look at it online, but at the moment it escapes me. Here is one final quilt I wanted to show you. This is, whoopsie, this is a Christmas ornament quilt. So the ornaments are hanging from rows of chevrons, but you can see here in the border that I did serpentine stitch, and I'm not sure if you can see the sparkles, but I used sparkly thread, and that is another way to add a really, just a bit of detail that takes your quilt up a little bit. to another level. So sparkly thread, contrasting thread gives you a completely different look. Variegated thread, um, lots and lots of different options for thread. So don't forget to experiment with all the different threads if you have a thread stash. And if you don't have a thread stash, be sure and look at the thread next time you're in the quilt store. I hope you'll give this a try. I usually just, like I said, I use the corner or the edge of my walking foot, but I wanted to show you also this little attachment. So this is what you call a seam guide, and you attach this, it slides into, on this particular machine, it slides into the walking foot or to the back of the presser foot. And then let me turn it around so you can kind of see the foot. What you do is you might mark like your first line or use a straight seam line to as a guideline for your first line of quilting. And then what you do is you move over and you run this little foot in that existing line of stitching. And you can adjust this closer or further from the needle and your existing line of stitching so that it allows you to quilt equidistant lines of quilting on your piece, and you don't have to really mark or measure because this is you're measuring as you go. So most seam guides look something like this. So look in your accessory box, and if you don't find one, ask your machine retailer if there's one available for your machine. Even some really old vintage machines that I have this kind of an attachment, so it's been around for a really long time. I really hope you'll give this a try on some of your projects. I hope you're finding time to sew for the holidays and enjoying the upcoming time off. We may not be gathering with friends and family as much as we normally would, but I still hope that you enjoy the time and have a wonderful, blessed holiday season. I would invite you to like the Annie's page and like the Quilters World page. They always have beautiful things up on their Facebook and Instagram pages. And then be sure and look at those for those issues when you are in the store with the newsstand at your grocery store or wherever you go. And then I would invite you to visit my little website called stashbandit.net. I write about interesting quilt related topics and share tips and tricks. I would love to see you there. It has been my pleasure to be with you today and share this little bit. And I hope to see you again very soon somewhere down the quilting road. Thank you so much. Goodbye.